The trap sat empty for the fifth morning in a row. Phineas Graylock crouched beside it, studying the gnawed leather straps and shredded doeskin that should have been intact supplies, and understood that he was losing a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Somewhere in the log walls of his winter cabin along the Green River, mice had found their way in. They had chewed through a month's worth of pemmican wrapping. They had fouled his coffee stores. They had nested in his spare blanket. And now, as October snow began falling on the Wind River Range in the autumn of 1832, Phineas faced a simple calculation that could mean the difference between surviving until spring and starving in the high country. A mountain man could face down a grizzly. He could navigate by stars across terrain that would kill a tenderfoot within days. He could survive on roots and bark when game disappeared. But rodents were different. They fought a war of attrition, invisible and relentless, and they were winning. For every ounce of food they stole or spoiled, Phineas would need to trap or hunt more. For every hour he spent protecting supplies from vermin, he lost time running his trap line. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. What Phineas discovered over that winter would transform how trappers built their cabins throughout the Rocky Mountains. The technique seemed simple once proven, but discovering it required observation, experimentation, and the willingness to trust patterns that contradicted everything mountain men thought they knew about cabin construction. The story of how one man turned the floor of his cabin into an invisible barrier against rodents is not just about survival. It is about recognizing that sometimes the best solutions come not from force, but from understanding the enemy's weaknesses better than they understand them themselves. Phineas Graylock had come to the Rocky Mountains in 1828 at age 22, leaving behind a Pennsylvania farm and 7 siblings who would inherit the land he never could. He had joined William Sublet's supply caravan heading west from St. Louis, signed on with the Rocky Mountain Fur Company at that year's rendezvous on Bear Lake, and learned the craft of trapping from older hands who measured a man's worth in pelts and resourcefulness. By 1832, he was established as a competent trapper with a regular trap line along the tributaries of the Green River, and enough experience to know that 4 years in the mountains meant he had survived what killed most men within 2. The cabin Phineas had built in the autumn of 1831 followed standard construction for the era. He had selected a site in a grove of lodgepole pine where the trees grew straight and close, felled 60 logs averaging 12 to 14 inches in diameter, and dragged them to his building site using a mule borrowed from another trapper. The structure measured 16 feet on each side, walls rising 7 feet at the corners where he notched the logs in the V-pattern common throughout the region. He had chinked the gaps between logs with a mixture of mud, clay, moss, and deer hair, following the method every mountain man learned. The roof was bark and sod over split log rafters. The door hung on leather hinges. One window covered in greased deerskin let in diffuse light. The floor was packed earth, as it was in most mountain cabins. Phineas had cleared the vegetation, removed rocks and roots, then trampled the exposed dirt repeatedly until it formed a relatively hard surface. This was standard practice. Puncheon floors made from split logs were known, but they required additional labor and time that most trappers couldn't spare. Split log floors were for permanent settlements, for families building homesteads. A trapper's winter cabin needed to be functional, not refined. Packed earth served well enough for men who spent most daylight hours outdoors and used their cabins primarily for sleeping and storing supplies. Or so Phineas had believed until the mice arrived. The first signs appeared in late September, small droppings near his food stores, gnaw marks on leather, the distinctive scratching sounds in the walls at night. Phineas set out spring traps made from bent willow branches and caught 2 mice the first week. The success felt promising, but for every mouse he caught, 3 more seemed to take its place. By mid-October, the population had exploded. Mice ran across his blankets at night. They nested in corners. They chewed through his supply sacks, contaminating flour and cornmeal with their droppings. They found his cached pemmican and rendered pounds of it inedible. Other trappers at the 1831 rendezvous on the Green River had mentioned rodent problems, but Phineas hadn't paid much attention. Now he understood what they meant. The mice weren't just a nuisance. They represented an existential threat. Every pound of food Phineas lost to rodents was a pound he would need to replace through hunting or trapping when game grew scarce in deep winter. His entire winter food reserve, calculated to last from November through April, assumed no losses to spoilage or theft. The mice were stealing from future months, and Phineas had no surplus to compensate. He tried multiple approaches that first winter. He hung supplies from the ceiling in parfleches suspended by rawhide cords. The mice climbed the cords. He stored food in wooden boxes sealed with pitch. The mice gnawed through the seams. He set more traps, catching dozens of mice, but the population only seemed to grow. By January, Phineas estimated he had lost 20% of his food stores to rodent damage and contamination. He survived the winter by running his trap line longer hours, taking more beaver than he had planned, eating the meat and drying it to compensate for losses. When spring came and the high country opened, Phineas rode to the 1832 rendezvous site at Pierre's Hole with a question that mattered more than beaver prices or where the next trapping grounds might be. He wanted to know how other mountain men dealt with cabin mice. The answers he collected were discouraging. Most trappers accepted rodents as an inevitable problem. Some hung food from rafters. Others built elevated platforms. A few kept cats, though cats were rare in the mountains and required feeding themselves. One older trapper from Kentucky mentioned that his family's barn had been relatively mouse-free because they had packed the floor with a mixture his grandfather used, but he couldn't recall the exact composition. Ash, he thought. Maybe lime. Something that smelled bad to mice. That fragment of information lodged in Phineas's mind as he spent the summer of 1832 working his trap line. He paid attention to where mice built nests and where they avoided. He noticed that mice rarely nested near his outdoor fire pits where ashes accumulated. He observed that they seemed to avoid areas where he had discarded pine bark stripped from logs during cabin construction. These were patterns, not proof, but they suggested possibilities. In September 1832, as Phineas prepared for his second winter in the same cabin, he decided to experiment. The packed earth floor had served adequately apart from the rodent problem. What if the floor itself could be modified to repel mice? The concept was simple, but the execution required solving several problems. Any floor treatment needed to be non-toxic to Phineas himself, needed to remain effective throughout the winter, and couldn't create worse problems than it solved. Phineas started with wood ash. After rendezvous, he had ridden to an area where a lightning strike had burned through several acres of lodgepole pine the previous summer. The site provided abundant ash, and he spent 2 days filling leather sacks with the fine gray powder. Back at his cabin, he swept the packed earth floor clean and spread a layer of ash roughly 1 inch thick across the entire surface. He worked the ash into the dirt using a flat stone, creating a mixed layer rather than just loose powder on top. The result was a grayish floor that felt slightly gritty underfoot, but seemed otherwise unchanged. The ash treatment showed immediate promise. Within days, Phineas noticed the mice avoided crossing the ash-treated floor. They still occupied the walls, he could hear them, but they no longer descended to ground level as frequently. The nightly sounds of mice running across his blankets ceased. The number of droppings on the floor dropped dramatically. Something about the ash deterred them. But ash alone had limitations. It was messy, creating dust that got into everything. It needed regular replenishment as it got trampled into the dirt. And while it reduced the mouse problem significantly, it didn't eliminate it entirely. Phineas observed that over time, as the ash mixed thoroughly with the floor dirt, its effectiveness decreased. The mice grew bolder. By late October, they were crossing the floor again, though less frequently than before. The breakthrough came from combining methods. Phineas had noticed that pine bark strips he had left outside his cabin seemed to repel insects and rodents. The bark, particularly from older trees, had a strong resinous scent. He hypothesized that the aromatic compounds in pine bark might enhance the ash treatment. In November, he spent several days stripping bark from standing dead pines, selecting sections that retained their strong pitch smell. He reduced the bark to small fragments and fibers by beating it with a stone, creating material that could be mixed with ash and dirt. The new floor treatment combined 3 elements: wood ash from pine fires, beaten pine bark fibers, and a small amount of water clay mud to bind everything together. Phineas removed the top layer of his cabin floor, exposing the original packed earth. He mixed ash, bark fragments, and mud in roughly equal proportions, creating a thick paste. This he spread across the floor in a layer about 2 inches deep, working it smooth with a flat board. The surface dried over several days into a hard, slightly rough finish that smelled strongly of pine and ash. The change was remarkable. Within a week, mouse activity in the cabin dropped to nearly nothing. Phineas could still hear mice in the walls, but they no longer descended to the floor. His food stores remained untouched. His bedding stayed free of droppings. The treated floor seemed to create an invisible barrier that mice would not cross willingly. Whatever combination of scent and texture the bark-ash-mud mixture provided, rodents found it intolerable. Understanding why the technique worked required observation and reasoning. Phineas spent hours watching how mice approached the treated floor. When a mouse descended from the wall and touched the treated surface, it would typically recoil immediately, groom its paws frantically, and retreat. The behavior suggested the treatment caused physical discomfort or an overwhelming scent response. The ash component likely irritated their sensitive paws and respiratory systems. The pine bark released aromatic compounds that overwhelmed their sense of smell, making it difficult for them to detect food or navigate confidently. The clay mud binder held everything together while adding its own subtle deterrent through texture and mineral content. The effectiveness came from layering multiple barriers. Mice have exceptional senses of smell, using scent to navigate, locate food, and communicate. The pine compounds created a scent wall that obscured other odors. The ash created a caustic environment that irritated exposed skin and mucous membranes. The mud-clay mixture, when slightly damp from cabin humidity, created an uncomfortable texture. Together, these made the floor a hostile environment that mice avoided. Critically, the treatment didn't kill mice or force them out of the cabin entirely. They remained in the walls, but they stayed there. This was important because mice that felt trapped and desperate might chew through barriers or take excessive risks. By making the floor uninhabitable while leaving the walls accessible, the treatment encouraged mice to establish territories that didn't overlap with Phineas's living space. It was defensive architecture through chemistry and texture. The winter of 1832-1833 proceeded without significant rodent problems. Phineas lost virtually no food to mice. His supplies remained secure. He slept without mice running across his blankets. The treated floor required minimal maintenance. Once monthly, he swept the floor and applied a light layer of fresh ash mixed with water, which absorbed into the existing treatment and refreshed its effectiveness. The technique worked, but Phineas was not yet satisfied. A technique that worked for one person in one cabin meant nothing if it couldn't be replicated by others in different conditions. Scientific proof in 1833 meant repeatability and consensus. If other trappers tried the method and achieved similar results, that would validate its effectiveness. If they tried and failed, Phineas needed to understand why, to identify what variables mattered. At the 1833 rendezvous on the Green River, Phineas mentioned his floor treatment to other trappers, describing the method without exaggeration or embellishment. The response was mixed. Some trappers showed interest. Others were skeptical. A few openly doubted that something as simple as ash and pine bark could solve a problem that had plagued mountain cabins since men first built them. One older trapper pointed out that plenty of cabins had ash from fire pits and pine bark from construction, yet still had mice. What made Phineas's mixture different? The question was valid and forced Phineas to think more carefully about what made his treatment effective. The key, he concluded, was concentration and application. Having ash in a fire pit was different from having ash incorporated throughout the floor. Occasional pine bark scraps were different from bark fibers systematically mixed into the walking surface. The difference was intentionality and thoroughness. Accidental exposure to these materials deterred mice somewhat. Deliberate, comprehensive application created an environment mice couldn't tolerate. 3 trappers agreed to try the technique that autumn. James Kittredge built a new cabin near the Snake River and treated the floor with ash bark mud mixture before moving in. Samuel Weatherby applied the treatment to his existing cabin floor on the Hoback River. Robert Chen, who trapped along the Green River several miles from Phineas, tried a modified version using cottonwood ash and juniper bark instead of pine, based on what materials he had available. The results from these 3 test cases provided valuable data. Kittredge reported excellent results with virtually no rodent activity in his cabin throughout the winter. Weatherby had mixed success. His cabin showed reduced mouse activity, but not elimination. Upon investigation, Phineas found that Weatherby had applied the treatment too thinly and hadn't incorporated it into the floor properly. The mice simply avoided the worst areas and concentrated their activity where the treatment was weakest. Chen's modified version using cottonwood and juniper showed moderate effectiveness, better than no treatment, but not as good as pine ash and bark. This suggested the specific aromatic compounds in pine were important, though not absolutely essential. These findings led to refinements in the technique. The treatment needed to be applied at least 2 inches thick and worked into the existing floor, not just spread on top. Pine was preferable, but other resinous woods could work. Fresh ash was more effective than old ash that had been weathered. The treatment needed reapplication every 4 to 6 weeks to maintain full effectiveness. With these guidelines established, the success rate improved dramatically. By 1835, perhaps 24 trappers across the Rocky Mountains were using variations of Phineas's floor treatment. The technique spread through personal recommendation and demonstration, passed from one mountain man to another at rendezvous and chance meetings along the trap line. No written instructions existed. The method transferred through oral tradition and hands-on teaching, as most practical knowledge did in the mountains. The impact extended beyond simple convenience. Reducing food losses to rodents meant trappers could provision themselves more accurately, could plan for leaner winters without padding their supplies excessively. It meant fewer trips to hunt when weather was dangerous. It meant sleeping without mice crawling across blankets, a small comfort, but one that improved quality of life significantly. For trappers operating on thin margins, where the difference between success and failure often came down to small advantages accumulated over months, an effective rodent deterrent represented real value. Phineas continued trapping in the Rocky Mountains through the 1830s, adapting as the beaver trade declined, and eventually shifted to other pursuits. In 1838, he guided a wagon train to Oregon, using knowledge of mountain passes and water sources he had gained during his trapping years. He settled in the Willamette Valley, married, and established a farm. But throughout his years in the mountains, the floor treatment remained his contribution to the collective knowledge of mountain men, a technique that solved a problem every trapper faced. The broader context of this discovery reveals how frontier innovation actually worked. Phineas was not a scientist in any formal sense. He had minimal education, likely could read and write at a basic level, but had never studied chemistry or biology. His understanding of why the treatment worked was observational and practical, not theoretical. Yet he solved a real problem through systematic experimentation, careful observation, and willingness to test ideas. This pattern repeated throughout frontier history. Practical innovations emerged from people who faced real problems and had the intelligence and persistence to solve them. These solutions often worked long before anyone understood the underlying mechanisms. Phineas didn't know that pine bark contains terpenes and phenolic compounds that disrupt rodent olfactory systems. He didn't know that wood ash contains potassium carbonate and calcium carbonate that irritate mucous membranes. He didn't need to know. He only needed to observe that certain materials repelled mice and figure out how to apply them effectively. The method also illustrates the difference between folk wisdom and practical technique. Many trappers knew vaguely that ash could deter rodents. Some had heard that certain plants repelled mice. But knowing something vaguely is different from developing a reliable method. Phineas's contribution was not discovering that ash and pine bark had deterrent properties. His contribution was figuring out the proper proportions, application method, and maintenance schedule to make those properties useful. The scientific explanation for why the treatment worked would not be understood until the 20th century, long after the mountain man era ended. Modern research on rodent behavior has identified the specific mechanisms. Mice rely heavily on their sense of smell for navigation and threat detection. Terpenes in pine bark, particularly alpha-pinene and beta-pinene, are detected by mouse olfactory receptors as strong irritants. These compounds trigger avoidance responses similar to how humans respond to tear gas. The concentration of these compounds in fresh pine bark is high enough to be aversive without being toxic. Wood ash contains multiple compounds that irritate rodent paws and respiratory systems. Potassium carbonate, the primary component of wood ash, is caustic at pH levels around 11. When mice walk on ash, the compound adheres to their paws and causes mild chemical burns. The alkaline environment is hostile to bacteria and fungi that mice use for scent marking, making the treated area seem foreign and dangerous. The fine particulate nature of ash means it becomes airborne easily, irritating nasal passages and making it difficult for mice to smell food or dangers. The mud clay binder served multiple functions. Clay minerals absorb moisture, creating a sticky surface when damp that was unpleasant for mice to traverse. The fine particles got into fur and required extensive grooming to remove, making the treated area energy-intensive to cross. Clay also bound the ash and bark into a durable surface that didn't require constant reapplication. The slight dampness maintained by cabin humidity kept the treatment active. What Phineas had created through trial and observation was essentially a broad-spectrum rodent deterrent that operated through multiple mechanisms. The treatment didn't just repel mice through one avenue that they could adapt to. It created an environment hostile in several different ways simultaneously. This multi-layered approach prevented adaptation. Mice couldn't simply get used to one irritant because multiple irritants worked together. Evolution hadn't prepared them to overcome simultaneous chemical, texture, and scent barriers. The technique's limitations are also important to understand. The treatment reduced rodent problems significantly, but rarely eliminated them entirely. Mice remained in the walls and occasionally would still cross the floor if sufficiently motivated, such as when food scents were overwhelming or when population pressure forced them to take risks. The treatment required regular maintenance. The materials needed to be locally available, limiting where the technique could be applied. And it worked primarily on mice and smaller rodents. Larger rodents like pack rats sometimes tolerated the treatment, though they too were deterred to some degree. Variations of the basic technique appeared in different regions adapted to local materials. In areas where pine was scarce, trappers experimented with cedar bark, juniper bark, and sage. Some added additional components like crushed chili peppers or strong-smelling herbs. A trapper in the Uinta Mountains discovered that adding crushed juniper berries to the mixture enhanced its effectiveness. Another in the Absaroka Range found that mixing in sulfur from hot springs created an even more pungent deterrent, though the smell was almost unbearable for humans too. These regional variations weren't systematic improvements. They were adaptations based on available materials and individual preferences. The fundamental principle remained constant: create a floor surface that mice found intolerable to cross through some combination of scent, texture, and irritation. The specific materials mattered less than understanding what properties those materials needed to have and applying them comprehensively. The technique also had an interesting social dimension. Trappers who used the method typically had cleaner, more orderly cabins. Food storage was easier. The constant low-level stress of fighting rodents was eliminated. This improved morale and mental health, factors that mattered enormously during isolated winter months. A trapper who slept soundly without mice crawling on him was better rested, more alert, and more productive. A trapper who didn't lose food to rodents had better nutrition and more energy for trapping. These advantages accumulated over months, making the difference between barely surviving winter and thriving through it. By the late 1830s, as the beaver trade collapsed and mountain men transitioned to other pursuits, the floor treatment technique began spreading beyond the trapping community. Settlers building cabins in Oregon and California learned it from former trappers. The method appeared in Mormon settlements in Utah, brought by converts who had worked in the fur trade. By the 1850s, variations of ash and bark floor treatments were common throughout the frontier West, though the origins of the technique had often been forgotten. Phineas Graylock died in 1871 in Oregon at age 65, having lived to see the frontier he helped open transformed into settled farmland. His obituary in the Oregon Spectator mentioned his years as a mountain man and his work as a guide, but made no mention of his contribution to cabin construction techniques. That knowledge had become so widely dispersed and commonly known that its origins had been lost. The technique was now just something everyone knew, part of the collective wisdom of frontier life. The story of Phineas and his rodent-proof floor treatment illustrates several principles about innovation and knowledge transmission on the frontier. First, practical problems drove innovation more effectively than theoretical curiosity. Phineas didn't set out to understand rodent behavior or develop new construction techniques. He needed to protect his food supplies from mice, and that need motivated experimentation. Second, solutions often came from combining existing knowledge in new ways rather than discovering entirely novel principles. Ash, pine bark, and clay were all familiar materials. Phineas's innovation was figuring out how to combine them effectively. Third, proof came through replication and consensus. The technique gained acceptance because multiple trappers tried it independently and achieved similar results. Fourth, knowledge spread through personal networks and demonstration rather than formal documentation. The technique transferred from one mountain man to another through conversation and hands-on teaching, adapting as it spread. These patterns repeated throughout frontier history. The West was developed not through grand scientific breakthroughs, but through accumulated small innovations like Phineas's floor treatment. A better way to preserve meat. A more efficient way to haul water. A technique for starting fires in wet weather. A method for deterring rodents. Each innovation individually was minor. Together, they made the difference between successful settlement and failure. The rodent-proof floor treatment also reveals something about how traditional knowledge worked. Before written instructions and standardized methods, practical techniques were preserved through apprenticeship and oral tradition. A younger trapper learned from an older one, not through reading but through observation and practice. This system was effective for transmitting practical skills but vulnerable to information loss. When practitioners died without passing on their knowledge, techniques could be forgotten. When methods spread rapidly through verbal description without hands-on demonstration, details were often lost or corrupted. Phineas's technique survived because it was simple enough to describe verbally, but effective enough that people who tried it continued using it and teaching it to others. The basic concept, mixing ash and aromatic bark into the cabin floor, could be explained in a single sentence. The details of proportions and application technique could be learned through trial and error. The method didn't require special tools or rare materials. These characteristics made it robust against the information loss that plagued more complex techniques. Modern rodent control has largely moved beyond ash and pine bark, relying instead on poison baits, electronic deterrents, and ultrasonic devices. These methods are more effective in some ways, but also more dependent on manufactured products and technical knowledge. Phineas's technique, primitive by modern standards, had the advantage of using materials anyone could gather from the natural environment. It required no special knowledge, no purchased products, no reliance on supply chains. It was appropriate technology for its time and place. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in traditional rodent deterrents as alternatives to poison and traps. Organic farmers and homesteaders have experimented with wood ash and aromatic plant materials, rediscovering some of the principles that Phineas worked out in 1832. Modern research has validated that many traditional deterrents have real effectiveness, though usually not as dramatic as synthetic alternatives. The ash and bark treatment that worked for mountain men can still work today in situations where its limitations are acceptable and its advantages matter. The enduring lesson from Phineas Graylock's story is not the specific technique he developed. Floor treatments have evolved, and modern pest control offers better solutions. The lesson is about problem-solving methodology. Faced with a persistent challenge, Phineas observed patterns, formed hypotheses, tested solutions systematically, and refined his approach based on results. He didn't need formal scientific training to follow the scientific method. He needed curiosity, persistence, and willingness to learn from both success and failure. This approach to solving problems characterized the mountain men as a group. They operated in an environment where mistakes were often fatal, where knowledge could mean the difference between survival and death. They learned to observe carefully, to test ideas thoroughly, and to share information freely. The harsh environment selected for these traits. Trappers who couldn't solve problems died. Those who could survived and passed on their knowledge. Phineas's contribution to mountain man technology was modest compared to innovations like the Hawken rifle or improved beaver traps. But it was real, it was useful, and it made life measurably better for men who faced enough challenges without adding rodent infestations to the list. That is perhaps the most important kind of innovation, the kind that solves everyday problems and makes difficult lives slightly easier. The spectacular breakthroughs that change history are rare. The steady accumulation of small improvements is what actually advances human welfare. When trappers gathered at rendezvous in the summers of the middle 1830s, trading furs and supplies, gambling and drinking, racing horses and telling stories, some of them talked about cabin construction and food storage and the best ways to keep mice out of winter quarters. Phineas Graylock's floor treatment was one topic in those conversations, passed along with dozens of other practical tips and techniques that made mountain life more bearable. Most of those conversations are lost to history, the knowledge they contained forgotten or superseded. But for a brief period in the 1830s and 1840s, in hundreds of cabins scattered through the Rocky Mountains, floors treated with ash and pine bark kept mice at bay and supplies secure. The technique worked because Phineas paid attention to what mice did and didn't like, because he experimented systematically, and because he was willing to try solutions that seemed too simple to be effective. Sometimes the best answers are simple. Sometimes the most useful innovations are modest improvements to everyday problems. And sometimes the legacy of a man's life is not measured in dramatic achievements, but in practical knowledge shared freely and used gratefully by others who faced the same challenges he had faced and overcome.